Hey there, welcome to the DFS Build NFL edition. I'm Kevin Roberts, getting ready to go over the Week 13 main slate over at DraftKings. The goal, obviously, is to help you win. And, if anything I do here helps you out, smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. Let's get into it. We're going to go position by position, looking at quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end, and defense to see what plays stand out and how you might want to build your lineups, whether you're doing single entry or entering a lot of contests. That's up to you. I'm just going to tell you what plays I like and what plays stand out. So let's start at quarterback right away up top. Jaden Daniels coming in with the best overall fantasy projection of the slate. I mean, last week he was chalky, even though he was kind of expensive at 7K, so his price is elevated just a little bit. He faces the Titans, who had been pretty stingy against quarterbacks, but over the last 4 weeks, they have dipped into the bottom 15, and on the year now, because of their regression, they're not that formidable of a matchup. And really, specifically, over the last 4 weeks, who's given up the most rushing yards to quarterbacks? It's been the Titans. So that's nice because Jaden Daniels obviously is a dual threat guy. They've given up 2 touchdowns on the ground too. So it looks like a pretty good spot, to be honest. I didn't really think it was going to be, going into the week because I just had been avoiding the Titans for a long time, and that had kind of worked out. But I don't think we can completely ignore Jaden Daniels here. Obviously, big game for the Commanders as they try to keep pace, up top in the NFC East. So his price remains about where it's been, and he just was a monster last week. Just a crazy game, 32 fantasy points against the Cowboys. Obviously, that is a much better matchup. But I got nothing bad to say here. This is just all about, do you want to pay over 7K for Jaden Daniels? The nice thing is he does come in with the best overall projection, and he's not carrying monster ownership. So Jaden Daniels is definitely very interesting. I just personally want to get as many running backs and wide receivers from a top level that I can on this slate, and paying up at running or quarterback isn't really going to be the best way to go about that. I think if you're going to play on like FanDuel, it does make a lot of sense to go pay for these dual threat quarterbacks who are really expensive, because then you're just getting that upside baked into the salary. I mean, you got to sacrifice something on every site you play at. But I just think there's a lot of really good options in the mid range and lower at quarterback specifically. And that is probably where I'm going to try to obtain a lot of the value on this slate. I mean, right away, second best projection at quarterback is Sam Darnold, only 5.9K. He's just a little bit behind Jaden Daniels. Despite the really good projection, his ownership is not egregious, just 6.6%. I'm not sure that's really going to hold based on everything that we're seeing right now. But he's been really good. I mean, there's nothing bad to say about Sam Darnold. In a vacuum, he's had 22 plus fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 games. He's got a stacked offense. He is just too cheap for who he's been. The only issue with this is I think he could end up being kind of chalky, and the Cardinals have not been a very soft matchup. Just over the last 4 weeks, they have been the number 1 defense against fantasy quarterbacks, giving up 1 touchdown through the air, giving up no rushing production. So it hasn't been a great matchup. Maybe they've benefited from some, good spots themselves. I mean, they faced Aaron Rodgers and the Jets in a game recently, so perhaps that plays into it. But hey, it is what it is. Arizona has not been a very fantasy-friendly matchup. So I do worry a little bit that Sam Darnold could be a little trappy. So I would watch the ownership. If the ownership spikes up and everybody kind of adapts to him having a really nice projection and a low price tag, I would be a little bit wary of that. If you want to pay up, you can. There's obviously Jaden Daniels there. You also have Lamar Jackson and Jalen Hurts. They are very, very expensive. So I personally don't really want to do that. I do think the game with the Ravens and the Eagles is certainly interesting because it's got major upside. That game is in the afternoon slate and is coming in with a 50.5 game total, which is very, very inviting. And both of these teams are pretty good against the run. So you would imagine there's a decent chance that we could see a lot of success through the air and a bit of an explosive matchup. I mean, we know the Ravens all year long. The Ravens have been very, very bad against quarterbacks. They've been bottom 5, and the Eagles, the best way to attack them is also, through the air. Even though on the season they have not been that friendly against against quarterbacks, but they've been just as bad, if not worse, on the ground. So it'll be interesting for sure. But they're very expensive. So while they're fine tournament plays, because Lamar Jackson has a massive ceiling, we know Jalen Hurts has a massive ceiling. So they're just really, really pricey. So I personally am probably going to go away from those guys due to the price points. But if they're not going to be owned, they are certainly interesting tournament plays if you have the funds to get up there. So Sam Darnold is one reason why we can kind of get away from these 7K plus guys. But another guy that makes me like just kind of dropping down is Justin Herbert. Only 5.6K, has a really nice matchup against the Atlanta Falcons. The Atlanta Falcons on the year have been a bottom 10 defense against fantasy quarterbacks, giving up 21 passing touchdowns and over 2,500 passing yards. And it's only gotten worse in the last 4 weeks. They are second to last, giving up 8 touchdowns through the air and no interceptions. They're a very, very good matchup, and we're in Atlanta in a dome. This is a shootout waiting to happen. And the game has a nice 48 total with a 1-point spread. So, yeah, looks super, super inviting. The only issue at all, I like everything about this for Justin Herbert. His price is nice. The matchup is good. Let's see here. His recent production is good. He's had 17 plus fantasy points in each of his last 5 games, 24 plus fantasy points in 2 of his last 5 games. So pretty darn nice floor, pretty solid ceiling. Everything looks good here. The only issue, he's going to be owned. He's coming in with 13% ownership. It's just like I say this every week. There is always that one guy that is a really nice price and a really good spot, and the only negative is the ownership, and I just don't really care. I think if you land on Justin Herbert at 5.6K, as long as he hits, I don't really care if he's owned. Now, if you want to have similar production and similar value and maybe get away from chalk, another option is going to be Matthew Stafford at 5.8K. So only $200 more. Projection's very similar, and he's coming in about half the ownership. He has a very palatable matchup against the Saints, who, excuse me, on the year, you wouldn't think that they've been, a defense we can attack through the air, but recently that has actually been the case. So I don't really see a reason why we can't keep targeting him here. I mean, just a couple weeks ago, Jameis Winston had like 356 yards and 2 touchdowns against them through the air. So the Saints are not like the most amazing matchup by the numbers, but this looks like a pretty decent spot for Stafford to possibly get it going here. He does have a pretty low floor, 10 fantasy points 3 weeks ago, but he does have really good weapons, and it's a solid spot. So I do not mind him as a pivot, but obviously Justin Herbert is a safer and better play with more upside, and I think the matchup in general is better too. I will mention Kyler Murray, 6.1K, so you're paying up a little bit more from Herbert. That's $500 more. Similar projection. He's not going to be owned at all because of the perceived negative matchup with the Vikings. But the reality is the Vikings stuff to run, and they send blitzes at you, and they see if you can make them pay. Kyler Murray, due to his ability to make plays with his legs, I think it's possible he can. Whether it be him taking advantage of that or just out of necessity, like the Cardinals playing from behind all game, I think he's a little bit interesting in tournaments, especially since he's not going to be owned here at all. Minnesota is not a soft matchup, though. They are a bottom 10, they're a top 10 defense against fantasy quarterbacks over the last 4 weeks. So it's not really my favorite spot by any means, but it's 6.1K Kyler Murray in a huge game after, Arizona did not look good against Seattle last week. So a nice little bounce back opportunity for him. It is on the road, so it's not going to be super easy to trust. But I think the price point and Kyler Murray's ceiling make him interesting, especially since he's not going to be owned whatsoever. If we want to, go back down and kind of just hang in like that 5.5K range, but you don't want to eat the mega chalk with Herbert. One guy I absolutely love is going to be Anthony Richardson, just 5.5K, so you're saving $100. Projection is not that far off from Herbert. Matchup with the Patriots is really, really nice. It's just really not much of a drop off. I think the drop off, if there is one, would be the fact that Anthony Richardson is not as reliable as Herbert as a pure passer. But oddly enough, the Patriots have been pretty darn bad against quarterbacks. They are tied for the most passing touchdowns given up over the last 4 weeks, 10, and they've given up 972 yards through the air, only 1 interception. So obviously New England could potentially benefit from Anthony Richardson not really being the most most cerebral and most efficient and most consistent passer out there. But hey, the matchup looks good. We know Richardson has a really nice floor technically because of his rushing ability, and he has a cannon for an arm. So if he can take advantage of the matchup, he could absolutely smash here. And I'll get to some passing game weapons that you can pair with him later. But I like him quite a bit as a pivot off of Herbert. He and Herbert are probably my 2 favorite quarterback plays of the entire slate. One other guy in the same range is Drake May, another dual threat guy. We know he can run a little bit. He has a matchup with the Colts. He's in that same game across from Anthony Richardson. I don't know if the game is really going to turn into a shootout, but the Colts are not the scariest matchup. I would probably rather attack the Colts on the ground. Not that I feel amazing about Ramondre Stevenson or anything, but they're bottom 5 over the last 4 weeks against running backs. So I don't know if I really want to attack them with Drake May. I just know that Drake May does have a bit of a ceiling. And we know he can also use his legs. So Drake May, let's see. You think he's been decent. I mean, 15 plus fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 games. So he's been okay. I think if he can connect on a couple of these big plays, I mean, he could end up smashing pretty easily at this price tag. So I definitely rank him lower than the guys have already discussed. But I think at 5.6K, he's an interesting tourney play with a projection that's not too far away from Richardson and Herbert, and he's not going to be owned like whatsoever. Somebody who's way safer and has a really nice ceiling, but is a little bit more expensive would be CJ Stroud. Smash spot against the Jaguars, who over the last 4 weeks are dead last against fantasy quarterbacks. I think you just need to pick your poison with the Texans. I think the Texans are in for a big week because the takeover defense is not very good. You just need to decide, is it going to be the passing game or is it going to be Joe Mixon? For me, it's just going to come down to ownership. If a lot of the ownership is flocking towards CJ Stroud, then I will gladly just go get Joe Mixon. Or, if just everybody's paying for Alvin Kamara and other running backs and Joe Mixon is getting overlooked, maybe we just fully stack the Texans, and the leverage isn't about within the Texans offense. It's about the rest of the field, right? Or the rest of the options out there. Regardless, 6.4K is kind of cheap for CJ Stroud in general. I know he hasn't been amazing on the year, but he's also had guys, in and out of the lineup. I think last week, even though the Titans, had been a kind of tougher matchup and he threw 2 picks, he still got 17 fantasy points, slowly starting to show a little bit signs of life. He just has not been a reliable guy with a massive ceiling for quite a bit now. Like last time he had 20 fantasy points was back in like week 5. So I get it. Tough to trust. But if you're going to bet on CJ Stroud popping off, this is a pretty good week to do it. One more guy I'll mention at quarterback is going to be Baker Mayfield. He is also in a smash spot against the Panthers. On the year, the Panthers have been pretty bad against quarterbacks. They are bottom 6, giving up tons of production, 21 touchdowns through the air. And, Baker Mayfield's just had a fantastic season. The only time Baker hasn't been doing well was when he had guys injured. So obviously Chris Godwin's done for the year, but he does have Mike Evans back. And he has had some good games even with these guys out. A couple weeks ago against 49ers, he had a big stinker. It was only 8 fantasy points, but that was like the only time all since week 3 that he had under 18 fantasy points. Like even when it has been going great, he's still been producing. And here we go, the Panthers. It's just a really good spot for the Buccaneers. Must-win situation for them too. So I think he's going to have a huge game. And I'll talk about stacking options with him as well. Obviously, Mike Evans is the most obvious pick. The only issue with Baker, I think, is just price. I mean, he's not really a rushing threat, so paying 6.6K for Baker when you could save 200 with Stroud or just save like 1,000 for Herbert. I just think Herbert is probably the best play at quarterback on the slate. And the ownership is obviously reflecting that too. So, like I said, if you don't want to eat the chalk, Anthony Richardson's a really good pivot. And some of these other guys are going to be interesting for tournaments too. But I think when it's all said and done, I want Herbert in most of my lineups. And if you just want like the ultimate ceiling and floor, you can go get Jaden Daniels, Lamar Jackson, or Jalen Hurts. I think all 3 are totally fine. And of that trio, I think I'm leaning Jaden Daniels if I have to pay up, just because I'm saving $500 to $800 for a guy who projects better than Lamar Jackson and Jalen Hurts and is going to be less owned than both of them probably. So that's crazy to think about, but that's possibly what we're looking at. All right, on to running back we go. Alvin Kamara for the third week in a row comes in with the best fantasy projection among running backs, and I think he's not the main chalk, but he's very close to it. He is the second chalkiest running back. We'll get to the other one in a little bit, but Kamara is just the role is massive in theory. But like last week, we saw Taysom Hill just cut into it just so much. It was just absurd. But hey, even though it hasn't worked out the last 2 weeks, and by the way, I was away from Kamara the last 2 weeks in particular because of the crazy expectations and the crazy ownership, and also the possibility of Taysom Hill siphoning some of that production last week. I was ahead of the curve on that. And if you faded along with me the last 2 weeks, you may have had a chance, some of these wild tourneys. But I don't mind going back to Kamara after 2 kind of down weeks, because the nice thing is, in both those games, he still had at least 18 touches and he still had at least 12 fantasy points. And this was without scoring a touchdown. And 3 weeks ago, he did not score a touchdown and he had 30 fantasy points. So if he can get back to catching more passes and maybe plunging in for a touchdown, Kamara is going to smash. So I think I am back on Kamara, even though he's pretty owned. Doesn't mean I need to go super, super heavy on him, because running back is just loaded. There's so many good options at running back, but I don't mind that chalk. And because the Rams are a really good matchup too. He's going to be at home in a dome against the Rams, who, on the year, they're bottom 10 against running backs, and it's only gotten worse as they are bottom 6 against running backs over the last 4 weeks. So it's a good spot. No problem eating the chalk. I do always like to get different if I can, and it makes sense. And one way we could do that, if you want to, is Joe Mixon, who I love. You pay $300 more. You get a slightly, inferior projection, but he is coming in at a fraction of the ownership, projecting for about 10% compared to Alvin Kamara's 28%. So my guess is they kind of give you the same production. I think they have similar floors and ceilings. If you don't believe me, just go check out Mixon a few games ago. 2 games ago, he had 38 fantasy points. Until a total dud last week when he had 9, he hadn't been below 9 or 17 fantasy points since week 2. So on the year, he has 2 games where he doesn't have 17 plus fantasy points. So his floor has been exceptional. It's worth noting that Nico Collins is back, so perhaps Houston's passing game takes off, and that kind of, works against Mixon a little bit. No doubt about it, that's possible. But it was nice to see that even with him not very effective last week against the Titans, he still had 19 total touches and 9 fantasy points without scoring. So that was not a good game, and I would not have been happy to play him during that. But I will not be afraid to go back to Mixon, in particular because the ownership's just not going to be there, and the Jaguars are an amazing matchup. While people might want to target the Jaguars through the air, they are dead last against running backs in fantasy points per game allowed over the last 4 weeks, and they are second to last on the year. So they are equal opportunity sad sacks across the board, no doubt about it. But I really, really like Joe Mixon, especially if like Nico Collins and CJ Stroud are going to end up carrying ownership at all. But the reality is he is a direct pivot on Kamara, so he looks really, really good. And if you want to pair them, that's fine too. But you're getting 10% owned guy compared to a 30% owned guy. I just like that quite a bit. Really a lot to like at running back. I think Bijan Robinson against the Chargers, I'm probably not doing that. I think there's other really good plays. Like I said, Kamara and Mixon, I think I prefer them over him. There's nothing wrong with Bijan Robinson. He's been very good for a while now. He's had 20 plus fantasy points in 5 of his last 6 games. He's been awesome. The problem is the Chargers are not really the softest matchup in the world. They're like 4th against running backs on the year. It's not good. So it's not, these guys are all fairly matchup proof. Like they can smash in any spot at any moment. I just think I'm going to be off of Bijan in this one. Chase Brown's probably the easiest lock in play of the slate. And I say that, kind of tongue in cheek, because he's 6.2K, which is really cheap for who he's been and the upside he offers. There's no doubt about it. And his projection's sick. He's got the 4th best projection of the slate. And all this is contributing to his crazy 40% ownership, right? So why would we not want to play Chase Brown? Well, because he's 40% owned. That's the first reason. I mean, if you want to just look at ownership and be like, nah, I'm not doing that, I wouldn't even blame you. You could just go away from him right away, and you don't need much more of a sales pitch. But if you wanted one, you could consider that the Steelers are not a fun matchup. You could consider that, in the last, 4 weeks here, the Steelers rank second in terms of fewest receptions allowed to running backs. In the last 4 weeks, they've given up no receiving touchdowns. And they've also been very unkind on the ground in general. They are, 5th against the run, only 211 yards allowed to running backs over the last 4 weeks. So the one thing they have done is they've given up 6 rushing scores. So that's fun. I mean, that's nice. And the other thing too is Chase Brown. He has a massive, massive role. 22 rushing attempts last week, 5 catches. I mean, he's had 22 plus touches in 3 straight games. So he's super, super involved. And they just don't have anybody else that they're confident putting out there at this point. So Chase Brown is just, it's all about role, it's all about price, and it's all about that's really what it is, because the Steelers are not a very fun matchup. So I think if you want to get away from it because of the ownership, you can look at that and also be like, hey, you know what? The Steelers have been pretty good actually against running backs in several regards. So you could argue out of it. I don't think I'm going to, because he's just really too cheap and the role is too huge. Like, he's going to probably just luck his way into getting there, even if things don't go well, because he's going to get so many dump offs and so many red zone opportunities. There's so many overall touches that I think he'll just be worth rostering. But my whole point here is to illustrate that there is a path to Chase Brown not working out. And anytime somebody's 40% owned, we definitely can consider not eating that chalk. I will note that Saquon Barkley at 8.5K is just really interesting because he's Saquon Barkley and he's not carrying ownership. So anytime Saquon Barkley is not going to be over 10% owned, we should consider him. He's very expensive at 8.5K, so that's a deterrent. He does not have a top 3 projection, which when a guy's pushing almost 9K, you kind of want him to. So that's not great. And then the Ravens are not a friendly matchup whatsoever. The Ravens are just kind of brutal against running backs on the year. Over the last 4 weeks, they've been closer to middle of the pack, but it's really more of a pass funnel defense. So I think he could still certainly exploit it and bust off long runs and pay off. There's no doubt about it. So at his ownership, I think he's a fun, interesting tournament try if you can get the funds to go play him. I'm not going to make a priority just because what is my main sales pitch here if I'm telling you to play Saquon? It's that nobody's going to play him. That's pretty much it. Same thing goes for Derrick Henry. Eagles are not the most fun matchup up front. Both these defenses, it's probably getting them through the air. So, like, if you do play Lamar and Jalen Hurts, you can fire up, say Flowers and AJ Brown and feel pretty confident about those stacks. But if you want to play Saquon and Derrick Henry and nobody's going to be on them, this would be the week to do it. Ken Walker looks really good at 7K. The Jets are just completely hopeless. They're done. Just mega cooked. So I have no issue with firing up Seahawks against them. I don't, on the year the Jets have been good against the pass. So if there's any chance that, that rises back up and New York's going to be good defensively in any regard, I would imagine it'd be against the pass. So Ken Walker's probably got a decent chance at having success here. And we know Ken Walker has a ceiling, and we know he has a huge role. So, he has not done much over the last 4 games. He has had 13 plus fantasy points in 3 straight, but it's been kind of quiet. It would not shock me if he had a bit of a blow up game here. And I also like that his ownership is kind of in check, under 10%, and he comes in with a solid projection. Also, the price is nice at 7K. So I think he is an interesting pivot down away from Kamara if you don't want to eat that chalk, or you can pay $800 more above Chase Brown if you don't want to eat that chalk. Also interesting is JT, 6.9K against the Patriots. not super owned, decent projection, kind of too cheap for what his ceiling can be. Kyren Williams, though, is probably the next stud that I would really want to get to outside of Kamara and Mixon. And obviously Chase is just, it's a price and roll play. So I don't want to say like Chase is an auto play in terms of ceiling or anything, or in terms of overall ability necessarily. So Kyren Williams, though, is going to be there for me because it's a really good matchup against the Saints. It's in a dome. It's a game with a solid total. Let me actually check that total just to be sure. Yeah, 49. I mean, there should be a good amount of offense here. He's been pretty quiet, but this really feels like a spot where he could get it going. I mean, he had been a touchdown machine on the year, and like lately he's been super quiet. He's had 10 plus fantasy points at 3 of his last 4, but just not really getting there with monster production. He's been running fairly efficiently, 4.1 yards per carry or more in 3 straight games. No catches in his last 2 games. That's a little bit disconcerting, but he's usually pretty involved. So I just would not be shocked at all if we had a big Kyren Williams game in a pretty good spot. So he's going to carry a little bit of ownership at 17%, but a good projection, good price. So he is definitely on my radar as a pivot down from Kamara, or just, pairing with him too. As far as paying up, last guy I'll mention is Breece Hall, 7.5K. I mean, I'm facing Breece Hall in Dynasty, like in many leagues. So I'm telling you, he's probably going to go off. But just like realistically speaking too, let's see. He's taking on the Seahawks, who really have not been the most amazing matchup. But this one is not really about the Seahawks to me. It's more about Breece Hall and the fact that he has a massive ceiling and a massive role. 31 fantasy points last week. He finally reminded us again of what he's capable of. In the previous 3 games, he like barely even totaled that many points. But that's just what he can do. 7 catches last week, 2 touchdowns, 21 total touches, 120 yards. So if they're going to feed him like they should, like if they're smart, they would feed him. He could just pop off here, and all things considered, 10% owned is just not enough. So he's very, very interesting. If you do not want to pay up at both slots, or you don't want to pay up at all, there are other good values. Chase Brown is the most obvious one at 6.2K. I don't really care about the chalk. I'm going to play him. Bucky Irving looks really good at 5.8K against the Panthers. You can consider any Bucks player against the Panthers this week. I did mention Ramondre Stevenson against the Colts. He's not going to be owned. Don't really trust the Patriots offense in general, but he is pretty cheap. He's only 5.9K. The Colts are a good matchup on the ground. Last week he was awful, but in 3 of his last 5 games, he has 20 plus carries. So if they're like in the game or even leading, Stevenson could get a ton of work and be a smash play here. So I actually do like Stevenson a good deal in tourneys. Not safe, but he is interesting. Gus Edwards is a really good value at 4.3K. It's probably going to be a 3-headed horse for the Chargers with J.K. Dobbins out, though. So it's not like somebody I feel like really confident in, but I do like the price. And he's coming in with the best projection of all the Chargers running backs. So if you want to play a Chargers running back, he's probably the one to play. And it's 4.3. I mean, what are you really going to ask for out of 4.3? I'm asking for probably 12, maybe 15 fantasy points. I'd feel pretty good about that. The matchup with the Falcons on the ground is pretty good. It's not too bad. Over the last 4 weeks, the Falcons have been a bottom 15 unit against running backs. Not really getting completely eaten alive on the ground or anything, just across the board. They're giving up a little bit of production, like just enough for a guy at 4.3 for me to not worry about it. One last guy I'll mention is Tony Pollard at 6.3K. Largely because nobody's going to play him because he's facing a solid Commanders defense, and it's a game where you would imagine the Titans would get blown up, and they might. But here's the deal: he had 24 fantasy points on 27 touches last game. If they're in the game, he's going to get fed the rock like crazy. So he's, in the name of Chase Brown, he's a little bit too cheap for his athletic ability and overall role, assuming the game stays close. So if it doesn't, obviously that's going to look like a horrible play. But here's the nice thing too, is that the Commanders have actually been just destroyed on the ground. In the last 4 weeks, they've given up the second most rushing yards to running backs. So, hey, if that continues, then Tony Pollard is going to look pretty darn interesting. I think that is probably it as far as popping out. I think overall at running back, I don't mind eating the Kamara Chase Brown chalk. But if you want to get different a little bit, I think Joe Mixon, Kenton Walker, and Kyron Williams are probably my favorite ways to do that. And then obviously Brees Hall too. All right, let me get a drink here. We can move on to wide receiver. Justin Jefferson is another guy that I'm facing in a lot of dynasty leagues. So definitely prepare for him to go off. So here's the other thing. Like I said with Sam Darnold, the Cardinals are not that good of a matchup. Like, I don't know why everybody's so excited about them. But Justin Jefferson is still Justin Jefferson. He's not been good lately, and the matchup is not as good as people seem to think it is. But he comes in at just 8.1K. He's not even the most expensive wide receiver on the slate. Like Jamar Chase is $500 more. AJ Brown's $200 more. So like he's kind of floating under the radar just a little bit, and yet he comes in with the best projection, and he's not even remotely close to the highest owned option. So while I hope he doesn't do well, because I'm facing him, Justin Jefferson looks like a really good tournament play. It's pretty rare that you get to walk into a tournament with Justin Jefferson at 12% ownership and the best projection of the slate for his position. So I don't think much more needs to be said there. Puka Nacua and Cooper Kupp both look great against the Saints. I think I would just lean towards the cheaper guy who's going to be a little bit less owned, and that's going to be Kupp. Puka comes in with a better projection, but they both could easily smash. I mean, Cooper had, 31 fantasy points. I think maybe it was even the last game or 2 games ago. Yeah, okay. 2 games ago, he had 31 fantasy points, and last game in a down game, he had 20. I mean, he's just crushing 20-plus fantasy points in 3 of his last 4. And also, Nacua is kind of, I guess they're both injury risks, really. But Puka, plays kind of recklessly. So, I don't know. I think across the board, Cooper's cheaper. He's got a similar projection, similar role, and a little bit less owned. So I think he's the play for me. But Puka is a fine play. If you want to play Puka, I don't have a problem with that whatsoever. AJ Brown is pricey. If you want to pivot away from Justin Jefferson, you can. And if you have the funds to get there, 8.3K against the Ravens, who are a pass funnel team, he's probably going to have a big game, especially with Devontae Smith still nicked up. I don't have a problem with him, just not a priority. I'd rather pay for Justin Jefferson, who is $200 cheaper, or I'd rather just go down to Kupp, who I think is a comparable play, if not a better play. Nico Collins looks really good, 7.9K. Like I said, you can decide how you want to attack the Jaguars, or you can just fully stack the Texans. They might drop 40 points in this game, seriously. Nico has massive upside, and the Jaguars don't really have anybody who can stop him, so he's cheaper than Jefferson and AJ Brown. So I think I prefer him over them too. Just all these guys look really, really good. You don't really need a big sales pitch for these studs. It just comes down to, who do you want to stack with? What games do you want to stack, and how do you want to play ownership? So the ownership seems pretty split. So I don't think I'd let the ownership, dictate things for you too much. I think it's going to come down to which guys can I actually comfortably fit into my lineup. And I think of everybody there, I think Cooper Kupp so far makes the most sense at 7.4K. Another guy that's projecting really, really well is Drake London at only 6.5K. He's just not expensive enough for his role or his ceiling. I mean, Drake London has been pretty good on the year, averaging 15 fantasy points per game. Kind of quiet last week with only 9, but that's what happens when you face the Broncos on the road. He had 17 the week before that, and he's been a little bit up and down, but we know he has a big ceiling, and we know he has a solid floor, and he faces a Chargers defense that is really bad against wide receivers suddenly. This is a very tough defense in terms of just raw points allowed per game, but they've given up the second most fantasy points per game against wide receivers over the last 4 weeks. So they are struggling lately. And this game is in a dome with where what I know I saw before. Let me check the point total here. Yeah, 48 total. Nice healthy total. So a lot of scoring here. This is a very stackable game in general. London looks like a nice comeback from a Justin Herbert, whoever you want to go there with wide receiver, which I'll talk about in a second. But Drake looks good. 4th best projection, and he's only 6.5K, and yet he's not like mega chalk. So I love Drake London. like him even more than Cooper Kupp. I think I still want to get Cooper Kupp in there as like my wide receiver 1, as my top wide receiver spend. But if you end on Drake as your wide receiver 1 here and go load up on running back or quarterback, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. And one reason why would be the presence of somebody like Lad McConkey. Nice projection. He's going to be owned because he's cheap at 6.1K. He's facing the Falcons, who are another really, really good matchup. In fact, they're worse than the Chargers. They're giving up the very most fantasy points per game over the last 4 weeks. So McConkey looks really good. He is going to be a little bit owned. But, I mean, he's just been super steady. 14 fantasy points last week, 21 fantasy points 2 weeks ago. Back in week 8, he had a massive 32-point fantasy outing. So, I mean, okay, McConkey is tough to trust because he's a rookie and he's kind of small, but everything looks good here. I don't love that he might be super chalky. I think the 70% ownership seems a little bit low, but I like him a lot. It's really hard not to like him at 6.1K. It's even easier to like him when you realize that the Chargers might not have a lot of success on the ground with J.K. Dobbins out, and they went to Quentin Johnson 5 times last week, and he had no catches and like 3 drops. So incidentally, I kind of like Quentin Johnson just because he's 5K flat in a really good spot, and nobody's going to want to play him. Very possible he gets you a goose egg or drops like a wide open 80-yard touchdown and just kills your soul. But he is a GPP play if I ever saw one. I mean, he's not going to be owned. He doesn't project well, but it's a great matchup, and he's too cheap for a guy who's going to be out there quite a bit and get some opportunities down the field. So I don't mind pairing them together, but I think he is also a really interesting leverage play on the kind of chalky-ish McConkey play. You could always go to Devontae Adams and Garrett Wilson just based off of pure volume. I don't think the matchup with the Seahawks is amazing, and I also don't really trust Aaron Rodgers at this point, but they're both probably going to get 10 targets in this game, in a game where the Jets trail throughout. So I don't mind them. I think I prefer Garrett Wilson just because he's more explosive. But yeah, they're both in play. Nothing wrong with them at all. I think I just prefer in that price range. I would prefer Drake London, or I'd go to George Pickens at 6.8K. Bengals have been a soft matchup all year, and Pickens has been pretty good with Russell Wilson there. So I think Pickens is probably a more compelling play than Adams or Garrett Wilson. The only issue there is those guys are going to be a little bit less owned than he is. Mike Evans is another interesting play in that range, 6.7K against the Panthers. Got nothing bad to say about him. Major red zone monster. He crushes the Panthers, by the way. So Mike Evans looks really, really interesting. Whether you play Baker or not, he is a little bit too cheap for what he can do. Honestly, wide receiver is just so loaded. Marvin Harrison looks interesting just because the Cardinals are probably going to be throwing because Minnesota stops the run well. He's tough to trust, but at 6K, I'm okay with taking a shot on him. In tourneys, Brian Thomas Jr., solid matchup against the Texans. A little comeback if you want to stack Houston. He looks good at 5.5K, especially with Trevor Lawrence back. Just endless things to like here. Now, if you want to go get a punt, I got 2 in mind. David Moore at 3.5K played 58 out of 62 snaps last week, and he faces the Buccaneers, who are one of the friendliest matchups to wide receivers, bottom 6 on the year against wide receivers. And the Panthers are going to be throwing all day in this game anyway. So as long as we can feel pretty good about him starting and being out there for a lot of the game, especially with Jalen Coker still out, I don't see the harm in trying him at 3.5K. Just know that he's definitely risky. Somebody who feels still risky, but maybe not quite as much, is going to be Adonai Mitchell. I'll go points per dollar here just to see where he pops up. He should pop up here pretty quickly. Here he is, Adonai Mitchell, 3.9. Not a great projection. He's going to carry a little bit of ownership because Josh Downs is not going to play this week. So, I mean, somebody on the Colts is going to hit, I would imagine, just because whether they come out and have success right away or they're playing from behind, Anthony Richardson's going to throw it to somebody, and I'm sure at some point he's going to hit somebody deep, right? I think Alec Pierce is an okay dart, and Michael Pittman is there. But Adonai Mitchell is cheaper than both of them. And the last time, he had a featured role, he did really well. So I think at 3.9K, he looks really, really interesting. Just seeing if anybody else really stands out as a guy like we have to talk about. I mean, Darnell Mooney, 5.6K in that Chargers Falcons game. I think he's a fine play. Don't mind him whatsoever. I think Tank Dell, where is he? I'm not seeing him actually. Tank Dell, somewhere in there. He's in there somewhere. He's there, 5.9K. I think he's an interesting play as a leverage on Nico. I don't think we have to go out of our way to leverage wide receivers on the same teams, but if you want to get exposure to the Texans passing game and don't want to eat an expensive chalky Nico, I think Tank Dell at 5.9 is kind of interesting. I will also mention Jamar Chase at 8.6K just because he's not carrying ownership. The matchup against the Steelers is not great, but he's pretty much matchup proof. So, yes, you can play Jamar Chase. I'm just probably not going to. All right, that's probably going to do it for wide receiver. Honestly, I could talk all day about wide receiver, and this video is already running pretty long. So, there's a lot of plays. For the most part, I think I'm going to hang in the mid range with Lad McConkey and Drake London. And I think there's solid value to go after. If I had to pick one, it's going to be Adonai Mitchell. And then I do not mind paying up for one stud wide receiver on the slate. But if I'm going to, it's probably going to be Cup. Okay, so at tight end, Trey McBride has just massive volume, so he's coming in with a crazy 18-point fantasy projection. Wouldn't you know it, I'm facing him in Dynasty this week too. It's going to be fun. He's been crazy. 24 plus fantasy points in 2 of his last 4 games. He's been, 15 targets last week, man. He's just crazy. So I can't wait to face him. It's going to be fun. And he's got a good floor too, 10 plus fantasy points in each of his last 7 games. Yeah, it's good stuff. The matchup with the Vikings is not great, I don't think. The Vikings are Vikings are like top 10 against tight ends, so it's not amazing, but pure necessity, pure volume, Trey McBride looks good, and the projections is disgusting. The funniest thing is he's not even that owned, and as far as stud tight ends go, 5.8K is not even egregious. I mean, we've seen stud tight ends at like 7K, so you're actually getting them at a bit of a discount. There's also Taysom Hill, who apparently we have to pay up for and chase a 42-point fantasy outing. I don't think that's going to happen again. I think he's still a good play at 5K, but I don't think we have to go eat the chalk, which currently is kind of being split between him and TJ Hawkinson. I think I'd prefer Hawkinson there. You get $600 savings. He's a little bit chalkier, but he just feels like a more interesting play. Also worth noting that the Rams on the year have been not that bad against tight ends. Actually, I think recently they've been kind of stingy. I thought I saw that. Maybe I'm wrong about that. No, actually, I am wrong about that. Recently, they've been giving up some production to tight ends, but no touchdowns over the last 4 weeks. Let's see. Let me just see if I can update it. Yeah, so it's not as bad of a matchup as I originally thought, but it's also not like a runaway spot as some would suggest. So I think Taysom Hill is fine at 5K. I think he's a little bit too cheap for the overall role he has, given the injuries the Saints have had. I mean, no Rashid Shaheed, no Chris Olave, so just naturally he's going to be a little bit more involved as a true receiver. And then obviously he has his hybrid role and like in the red zone and everything. And as noted, if Kamara has a soft matchup on the ground, then obviously so does Taysom Hill, right? So I think he's fine. It just does feel a little bit chasey. Are we going to be disappointed if we pay 5K for Taysom Hill and he comes in and gets 12 to 15 fantasy points? Not really. But in the same breath, he's not going to get 42 fantasy points again. So Hawkinson at 4.4K. He's got a pretty good role. I mean, last week he had a massive role, 9 targets, 7 catches, 21 fantasy points. If we can get more of that, he looks way, way too cheap at 4.4K. So I do not mind eating the chalk there. Will Disley in that Chargers Falcons game, 4K flat. That feels a little bit too cheap. He looks like probably my favorite value at tight end, but there's a lot of decent ones. Zach Ertz, Hunter Henry, Mark Andrews. All these guys look solid. Pat Freiermuth is a little bit interesting at 3.5K because the Bengals have been bad against tight ends. Second most touchdowns allowed to tight ends on the year. They've been bad against tight ends all season long. But my favorite tight end overall is probably going to be Cade Otton. While I love Mike Evans, Cade Otton is just mega cheap exposure to this Buccaneers passing game. And the Panthers actually have given up the most touchdowns to tight ends on the year. And naturally, they've given up the most fantasy points per game to tight ends on the season, too. Cade Otton comes in with the 5th best projection. And he's not going to be owned because all the ownership's getting sucked up by Evan Ingram, TJ Hawkinson, and Taysom Hill. So those guys are great plays, but Otton is a direct pivot off of Hawkinson, and $500 in savings off from Taysom Hill. So I like Cade the most, but I do not mind eating that chalk if you feel more comfortable with that. All right, to wrap things up, let's go to defense. As usual, I just want to save money on defense if I can. Just target, teams that turn the ball over, aren't very good on offense, or just have young, players, or they might be playing from behind. So the Colts at 2.8K against Drake May, they look fine. They're coming out as the chalkiest option, though, so they'll probably fail miserably. It's just the way it always goes. The Commanders against Will Levis, that looks pretty good. Only problem is they're 3.4K. If you want to pay and you want to get somebody who's just going to get it done, I think they look good. Or the Buccaneers at 3.6, or the Texans at 3.5. They're taking on the Panthers and Jaguars respectively. Nothing wrong with them. I just don't want to pay up because defenses are a crapshoot and they just don't work out as consistently as a stud running back or something. So if I can also just free up money to go get more running backs and wide receivers, that is what I would like to do. You can punt with anyone, whether it be the Jaguars or Titans or the Panthers. Like, are you feeling great about those defenses? No, not really. The one I would feel kind of good about, even though it doesn't make total sense, is going to be the Cardinals. The matchup with the Vikings is obviously suboptimal because the Vikings are super talented and they are a very good team. But Arizona's defense has been pretty good. They did lose the Seahawks last week, but only gave up 16 points. Actually, technically, they only gave up 10 points. And they've scored as a unit 11 plus fantasy points in each of their last 3 games. They're getting, they're getting sacks. They're getting turnovers. They're not giving up many points. They've literally given up 10 or fewer points in each of their last 3 games. So defensively, Arizona they're checking out as a pretty good play here. And also, they're just a solid leverage play against the Minnesota offense, which is going to carry a good amount of ownership. All right, so that does it for me. This one lasted a bit long. But hopefully this helps you out a little bit, helps you decide what you want to do on some chalky plays, helps point you to some plays that perhaps you weren't even thinking about that much. I think general strategy for week 13 is going to be punting defense. Arizona is my first call. Somebody in the 2.4 to 2.9 range is where I'm targeting. That's what I always want to do. If you feel like there's somebody else that is better, go for it. At tight end, Trey McBride looks great. But I don't really want to pay 5.8K for my tight end. I would rather just drop down and go get Cade Otton or TJ Hawkinson. And right now I prefer Cade Otton. At wide receiver, Cooper Kupp is my favorite spend up, but I love Drake London and Ladd McConkey, and Adonai Mitchell is my favorite value. At running back, I do not mind the chalk in Kamara or Chase Brown whatsoever. But Joe Mixon really stands out, and I like Kent Walker, Kyron Williams, and Breece Hall a good bit. Gus Edwards as a punt at 4.3 is not a bad thing either. At quarterback, Jaden Daniels, Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts are super safe with massive ceilings, but they also cost a crap ton of money. So Sam Darnold looks like a good value, or you could drop down to Justin Herbert or Anthony Richardson. My 2 favorites are going to be Herbert and Richardson, with Herbert being my favorite quarterback play of the week. All right, that is going to do it for me. Hopefully this helps you out. And if it does, smash that like button and also give us a subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching and good luck.